The courthouse steps felt cold beneath my feet as I clutched the deed to my grandfather's 500-acre farm, my hands shaking not from the autumn wind, but from the weight of what I just won. Karen Cooper, my aunt, who I'd only met 3 weeks ago, stood 20 feet away with her lawyer, her face twisted in a fury I'd never seen before. She tried to steal everything my grandfather left me, claiming I was too young, too inexperienced, too much of a stranger to deserve his legacy. But here I was, 18 years old and holding proof that sometimes the system actually works for kids like me. The judge's words still echoed in my mind. The will is valid. The property belongs to Hannah Taylor. Case dismissed. Karen had stormed out without looking at me, but I could feel her hatred burning through the courthouse doors. I'd won, but standing there on those steps, I realized this was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. Let me take you back to where this all started, 3 months ago when I was still counting down the days until I aged out of foster care. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. I was 17, living in my fourth placement in 2 years, when the letter arrived that would change everything. The return address read Powell and Associates, attorneys at law, from a town called Cedar Ridge that I'd never heard of. Inside was news that felt like a dream and a nightmare rolled into one. My grandfather, Dennis Powell, had died and left me his entire farm. 500 acres of prime farmland, a house built in 1923, and enough savings to keep the operation running for at least 2 years. The problem was, I'd never heard of Dennis Powell in my life. According to the letter, he was my mother's father, and he'd been searching for me since she died in that car accident when I was 3. He'd found me just 6 months before his own death, but had been too sick to make contact. Instead, he'd spent his final months updating his will and leaving me detailed letters explaining everything. Sharon Ruiz, my caseworker, sat across from me in the group home's cramped office as I read the letter for the third time. Her expression was a mixture of skepticism and hope that I'd seen too many times before. False promises and disappointments were standard in our world, but this felt different. The lawyer, Tyler Long, had included copies of birth certificates, DNA test results that my grandfather had somehow obtained, and photographs of my mother as a child that looked exactly like me. You have to understand, I'd been in the system since I was 3 years old. 14 years of temporary families, broken promises, and the constant reminder that I was unwanted. The idea that someone had been looking for me, that I had family I'd never known about, was almost too much to process. But there was something else in that letter that made my blood run cold. My grandfather mentioned that his daughter, my Aunt Karen Cooper, had been estranged from the family for 20 years and would likely contest the will. The next week felt like a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and legal consultations. Tyler Long explained that my grandfather had been meticulous in his planning. He'd known that Karen would fight the inheritance and had prepared accordingly. The will was ironclad, witnessed by 3 people, including the town doctor and the local bank president. He'd also left specific instructions that I was to receive all his personal papers and a safe deposit box key when I turned 18, which was still 3 months away. But Karen Cooper wasn't waiting for my birthday. 2 weeks after the initial letter, Tyler called to tell me that she'd filed papers claiming that I was an imposter, that her father had been mentally incompetent when he wrote the will, and that as his only living child, she deserved the inheritance. She was demanding that the court freeze all assets until the matter could be resolved. I remember hanging up the phone and feeling that familiar sinking sensation I'd experienced so many times before. Just when something good was about to happen, it got ripped away. Sharon found me sitting in the hallway, staring at the wall, and for the first time in years, I cried. Not the angry tears I'd shed over failed placements or broken promises, but deep, soul-crushing sobs for a grandfather I'd never met who had loved me enough to leave me everything. The decision to go to Cedar Ridge wasn't really a decision at all. Tyler Long had suggested I wait until after my 18th birthday to visit the property, but I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. I convinced Sharon to let me take a weekend trip to see the farm and meet with the lawyer in person. The 4-hour bus ride gave me plenty of time to imagine what I might find, but nothing prepared me for the reality. Cedar Ridge was the kind of small town that looked like it had been frozen in time around 1950. Main Street stretched for exactly 6 blocks, lined with brick buildings that housed a hardware store, a diner called Mabel's, a bank that was only open 3 days a week, and Tyler Long's law office above the feed store. The whole place had a population of maybe 800 people, and I got the feeling that everyone knew everyone else's business going back 3 generations. Tyler Long was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the stuffy lawyer in an expensive suit that I'd pictured, he was a man in his 40s wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, with dirt under his fingernails and a genuine smile that reached his eyes. His office was cluttered with farm equipment catalogs and local newspaper clippings, and he offered me coffee in a mug that said "World's Greatest Grandpa." He spread out a detailed map of the property on his desk, pointing out the boundaries with a pencil worn down to a stub. 500 acres of some of the best farmland in the county, he explained, with a creek running through the northeast corner and enough timber to build 3 houses. The main house sat on a small hill overlooking the fields, with a barn that could house 50 head of cattle and enough outbuildings to run a serious operation. But then he showed me the photographs that Karen Cooper had submitted to the court, and my heart sank. The house looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. Shutters hung at odd angles, the front porch sagged in the middle, and weeds had grown up around the foundation until they nearly reached the first floor windows. The barn wasn't much better, with several boards missing from the sides and what looked like a significant hole in the roof. Tyler must have seen the disappointment on my face because he leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. "Your grandfather knew the place needed work," he said. "That's why he left you the money to fix it up. He also knew you'd need help, which is why he arranged for Mark Ortiz to stay on as foreman. Mark's been running the day-to-day operations for the past 5 years, and he knows every inch of that land." The drive out to the farm took 20 minutes on roads that got progressively narrower and more rural. Tyler drove his pickup truck slowly, pointing out neighboring farms and explaining the local history. "Most of the land around here has been in the same families for generations," he said. "Your grandfather's place is one of the oldest homesteads in the county. His great-grandfather built the original house in 1873, though your grandfather rebuilt most of it in the 20s. When we finally turned into the long gravel driveway, I got my first real look at my inheritance, and it was both better and worse than the photographs had suggested. The house was definitely run down, but it had good bones. The wraparound porch needed new boards and paint, but the structure was solid. The barn was larger than I'd expected, easily big enough for the cattle operation Tyler had described, and the land, stretching out in all directions under the late afternoon sun, was absolutely beautiful. Mark Ortiz was waiting for us on the front porch, and I could tell immediately that he was sizing me up. He was probably in his 50s, with the weathered hands and permanent squint of someone who'd spent his entire life working outdoors. He didn't say much during our introduction, just nodded when Tyler explained who I was and why I was there. The inside of the house was a time capsule. My grandfather had lived simply, with furniture that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1940s and family photographs covering every available surface. But it was clean and well-maintained, and there was something about the way the afternoon light streamed through the kitchen windows that made me feel, for the first time in my life, like I was home. Tyler showed me to my grandfather's study, where boxes of documents waited to be sorted through. Letters dating back decades, financial records, and most importantly, a series of journals where my grandfather had documented his search for me. Reading his words was like getting to know him posthumously, and I found myself crying again as I learned about the man who had never stopped looking for his granddaughter. He'd hired private investigators, contacted every social services office in 3 states, and spent thousands of dollars trying to track me down. The journals revealed that he'd found me 6 months before his death, but had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer the same week. Instead of disrupting my life while I was still a minor, he decided to wait and prepare for my inheritance instead. Mark knocked on the study door as the sun was setting, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression that was slightly less suspicious than before. We sat on the front porch in comfortable silence for a while before he finally spoke. "Your grandfather talked about you every day for the last 6 months of his life," he said. "He was real proud of you, even though he'd never met you. Said you had to be tough to survive what you'd been through." That night, Tyler drove me to the one motel in Cedar Ridge, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandfather sitting in that study, writing in his journals about the granddaughter he'd never met, planning for a future he wouldn't live to see. I thought about my mother, who I barely remembered, growing up in that house and walking the same halls I'd walked that afternoon. The next morning, I was back at the farm before sunrise, unable to stay away. Mark was already in the barn, tending to the dozen cattle that were all that remained of what had once been a much larger herd. He handed me a pair of work gloves without comment and showed me how to help with the morning feeding. For the first time in years, I felt useful. Over breakfast at Mabel's diner, Tyler explained the legal situation in more detail. Karen Cooper's challenge to the will was based on three claims: that I wasn't really Dennis Powell's granddaughter, that he'd been mentally incompetent when he wrote the will, and that he'd been unduly influenced by someone seeking to defraud the estate. All three claims were easily disprovable, but the legal process would take time. The DNA evidence was conclusive, Tyler said, stirring sugar into his coffee. Your grandfather had that done by a certified lab, and there's no question about your parentage. As for mental competency, I have statements from three doctors confirming that he was sharp as a tack right up until the end. The undue influence claim is just desperate, since he wrote the will himself and had it witnessed by people who'd known him for decades. But Karen wasn't giving up easily. Over the next few weeks, as I waited for my 18th birthday and the legal resolution, she filed motion after motion, each one designed to delay the process and drain the estate's resources. She claimed that the farm was being mismanaged, that I was living there illegally, and that valuable assets were being stolen or destroyed. None of it was true, but each accusation required a response, and Tyler was spending more time in court than he was in his office. Meanwhile, I was learning what it meant to be responsible for 500 acres of working farmland. Mark taught me to drive the tractor, to recognize signs of disease in the cattle, and to read the weather patterns that determine when to plant and when to harvest. The work was harder than anything I'd ever done, but it was also more satisfying. Every morning I woke up knowing exactly what needed to be done and why it mattered. The cattle depended on me for food and water. The fields needed to be prepared for spring planting. The equipment had to be maintained and repaired. For someone who'd spent 14 years feeling useless and unwanted, the sense of purpose was intoxicating. But Karen Cooper wasn't finished. 3 weeks before my 18th birthday, she showed up at the farm with a court order demanding an inventory of all assets and a formal appraisal of the property. She brought two men in suits who spent the entire day measuring, photographing, and cataloging everything from the antique furniture in the living room to the tools in the barn. I watched from the kitchen window as they worked, feeling violated and angry. This was my home now, the only place I'd ever felt like I belonged, and she was treating it like evidence in a crime scene. Mark found me there and put a hand on my shoulder. "Don't let her get to you," he said. "Your grandfather dealt with her nonsense for 20 years. She's always been jealous of what she couldn't have." That evening, Tyler called with news that made my blood run cold. Karen had filed an emergency motion claiming that I was damaging the property and that immediate intervention was necessary to preserve the estate's value. She wanted the court to appoint her as temporary administrator until the will contest could be resolved, which would give her complete control over the farm and the authority to evict me. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, just days before my 18th birthday. Tyler assured me that the motion would be disputed, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Karen had hired a lawyer from the state capitol, someone with a reputation for aggressive tactics and expensive suits. They were clearly planning to make this as difficult and costly as possible. I spent the weekend reading through more of my grandfather's journals, looking for anything that might help our case. What I found was a detailed account of Karen's relationship with the family, and it painted a picture of someone who had always been driven by greed and resentment. She'd borrowed money from my grandfather repeatedly over the years, never paying it back, and had finally been cut off completely when she'd tried to forge his signature on a loan document. The journals also revealed something else. My grandfather had known this fight was coming and had prepared for it. Hidden in his safe deposit box were recordings of phone conversations with Karen, letters she'd written demanding money, and documentation of her attempts to have him declared incompetent years earlier when she'd first learned about his cancer diagnosis. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of steady drizzle that seemed to seep into your bones. The courthouse was packed with people I'd never seen before, most of them wearing expensive clothes and serious expressions. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer, a thin man with silver hair who looked like he charged $500 an hour just to breathe. Tyler had warned me not to expect much from the hearing, but I wasn't prepared for the character assassination that Karen's lawyer unleashed. He painted me as a troubled foster child with a history of behavioral problems, someone who was clearly taking advantage of an elderly man's loneliness and confusion. He claimed that I'd somehow manipulated my grandfather into changing his will, despite the fact that we'd never met. The lies were so outrageous that I wanted to stand up and scream, but Tyler kept a firm hand on my arm and whispered for me to stay calm. "We'll get our turn," he said, "and when we do, we'll destroy every one of their arguments." When Tyler finally stood to present our case, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. He methodically dismantled each of Karen's claims, presenting evidence that was so overwhelming that even her expensive lawyers started to look uncomfortable. The DNA tests, the medical records, the witness statements, and finally, the recordings from my grandfather's safe deposit box. The recordings were devastating. In one, Karen could be heard screaming at my grandfather about money, threatening to have him committed if he didn't give her access to his accounts. In another, she admitted that she'd been trying to find me for years, not out of family concern, but because she was afraid I might someday claim an inheritance that she considered rightfully hers. But the most damning evidence was a letter Karen had written to my grandfather just 6 months before his death. In it, she explicitly stated that she would never accept me as part of the family and would fight any attempt to leave me anything in his will. She called me a stranger and a fraud, despite having never met me, and demanded that he leave everything to her as his only legitimate heir. The judge listened to everything with an expression that grew more stern by the minute. When both sides had finished presenting their arguments, he didn't even bother to recess for deliberation. The motion for temporary administration was denied immediately, and he issued a warning that any further frivolous filings would result in sanctions against Karen and her attorney. Walking out of that courthouse felt like the first real victory of my life, but I knew it wasn't over. Karen's challenge to the will itself was still pending, and Tyler warned me that she might try other tactics to force me off the land. But for now, I was free to return to the farm and continue learning what it meant to be Dennis Powell's granddaughter. The week leading up to my 18th birthday was a whirlwind of activity. Mark had arranged for several neighboring farmers to help with repairs to the barn roof, and I found myself part of an impromptu work crew that included men and women who'd known my grandfather for decades. They shared stories about him as we worked, painting a picture of a man who'd been respected throughout the community for his integrity and generosity. Helen Reed, who owned the farm to the east, told me about the time my grandfather had helped her family through a difficult harvest when her husband was sick. Jeremy Gomez, whose property bordered ours to the south, described how my grandfather had always been willing to lend equipment or expertise to anyone who needed it. Kevin Hall, the local veterinarian, explained that my grandfather had often paid for medical care for animals belonging to families who couldn't afford it. These weren't just neighbors, I realized. They were my grandfather's chosen family, the people who'd been there for him when his own daughter had turned her back on him. And now they were extending that same loyalty and support to me, not because I'd earned it, but because I was his granddaughter, and that was enough. My 18th birthday fell on a Tuesday, and I celebrated it by officially taking ownership of the farm and opening my grandfather's safe deposit box. Inside, along with the legal documents Tyler had already shown me, was a letter addressed to me personally, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. The letter was everything I'd hoped for and more. My grandfather wrote about his regret at not being able to raise me himself, his pride in the young woman I'd become despite the circumstances, and his hopes for what I might accomplish with the farm. He explained his vision for the property, his dreams of seeing it return to its former glory, and his belief that I had the strength and determination to make it happen. But the most important part of the letter was his explanation of what family really meant. He wrote that Karen had never understood that being related by blood wasn't enough to make someone family. True family, he said, was built on love, loyalty, and mutual support. It was something you chose and earned, not something you were born into. He'd seen that kind of family in the foster children he'd worked with as a volunteer over the years. Kids who'd formed unbreakable bonds with people who weren't related to them at all. He'd seen it in his neighbors and friends, people who'd stood by him through good times and bad. And he hoped that I would find it too, both in the community that was waiting to welcome me and in the family I might choose to build for myself someday. The final court hearing was scheduled for the following month, and Tyler was confident that we would win decisively. Karen's case had been falling apart since the first hearing, and her lawyer was clearly advising her to settle out of court, but she was too proud and too angry to accept defeat gracefully. In the meantime, I threw myself into learning everything I could about farming. Mark was a patient teacher showing me how to read soil conditions, plan crop rotations, and manage livestock. The neighboring farmers were equally generous with their knowledge, inviting me to watch their operations and explaining the complexities of modern agriculture. I also spent hours in my grandfather's study, reading through decades of farm records and learning about the history of the land. The property had been in the Powell family for over a century, passed down from father to son through 4 generations. I was the first woman to inherit it, and the first person to come to it from outside the agricultural community. But I was determined to prove that I belonged there, that I could honor my grandfather's legacy and continue the tradition he'd established. Every morning I woke up before dawn to help Mark with the cattle. Every evening I studied farming journals and agricultural reports until my eyes burned. Every weekend I worked on repairs and improvements to the buildings and equipment. The work was exhausting, but it was also transformative. For the first time in my life, I had a purpose that extended beyond just surviving from one day to the next. I was building something, creating a future that would outlast my own lifetime. I was becoming the person my grandfather had believed I could be. The final court hearing arrived on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after my grandfather's death. The courthouse was less crowded this time, but the tension was just as thick. Karen sat with her lawyer, looking older and more bitter than she had at the previous hearings. Her case had been reduced to desperate arguments about technicalities and procedural errors, but she was still fighting. Tyler had prepared meticulously for this moment. He presented a timeline of events that clearly showed my grandfather's mental competency throughout the will writing process. He introduced testimony from the 3 witnesses who had signed the will, all of whom confirmed that my grandfather had been lucid and determined when he'd made his final wishes known. Most importantly, he played the complete recordings from my grandfather's safe deposit box, including conversations where my grandfather explicitly stated his reasons for leaving the farm to me instead of to Karen, who, in his own words, my grandfather explained that Karen had shown no interest in the farm or the family legacy, that she had repeatedly demonstrated her inability to manage money responsibly, and that he believed I would be a better steward of the land he'd spent his lifetime building. Karen's lawyer made one final attempt to paint me as an unfit heir, arguing that I lacked the experience and resources necessary to manage such a large operation. But Tyler was ready for this attack too. He called Mark Ortiz to the stand, and Mark testified that I'd shown more aptitude for farming in 3 months than some people developed in years. He described my work ethic, my willingness to learn, and my genuine love for the land. Then Tyler called Kevin Hall, the veterinarian, who testified about my dedication to the cattle and my quick mastery of animal husbandry. Helen Reed spoke about my integration into the farming community and my respect for the traditions my grandfather had established. Jeremy Gomez described the improvements I'd already made to the property and the plans I'd developed for future expansion. By the time all the testimony was finished, it was clear that this wasn't just about a legal inheritance anymore. This was about whether I belonged in Cedar Ridge, whether I deserved the trust my grandfather had placed in me, and whether I could carry on the legacy he'd built. The community had already answered those questions with their support and acceptance. The judge's decision was swift and unambiguous. The will was valid, the inheritance was mine, and Karen's challenge was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she could never file another claim based on the same arguments. As he read his ruling, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I'd been carrying for 18 years. Karen left the courthouse without speaking to me, but her expression said everything. She'd lost more than a legal battle. She'd lost her last chance to profit from a father she'd never really loved. I felt sorry for her in a way. She'd spent so much time focused on what she thought she deserved that she'd missed out on the real treasure, being part of a family and a community that cared about more than money. The celebration that night at Mabel's Diner was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It seemed like half the town had shown up to congratulate me and welcome me officially into the community. Farmers who'd known my grandfather for decades shared stories and offered advice. Younger people my age introduced themselves and invited me to join local organizations and social groups. For someone who'd spent her entire life as an outsider, the warmth and acceptance was overwhelming. These people didn't care that I'd grown up in foster care or that I didn't know anything about farming when I'd arrived. They cared that I was Dennis Powell's granddaughter, that I was willing to work hard, and that I was committed to being a good neighbor and community member. Mark Ortiz pulled me aside during the celebration and handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a pocket watch that had belonged to my great-great-grandfather, the original homesteader who'd built the first house on the land. "Your grandfather wanted you to have this," Mark said. "He told me to give it to you after you'd proven yourself worthy of the family name." The watch was beautiful with intricate engravings and a chain worn smooth by generations of hands. But more than that, it was a symbol of continuity, of my place in a family history that stretched back over a century. I was no longer just Hannah Taylor, the foster kid with no past and no future. I was Hannah Powell, heir to a legacy and keeper of a tradition. Over the following months, I threw myself into the work of restoring the farm to its former glory. With the legal battle behind me, I could focus entirely on learning and improving. I enrolled in agricultural extension courses, joined the local farming association, and began implementing the expansion plans my grandfather had outlined in his journals. The first year was challenging in ways I'd never imagined. There were equipment breakdowns, weather disasters, and market fluctuations that tested every skill I'd learned. But there were also successes that filled me with pride. My first successful harvest, the birth of healthy calves, and the gradual transformation of the property from rundown to thriving. More importantly, I was building relationships that would last a lifetime. Mark became like a father to me, patient and supportive, but never hesitant to tell me when I was making mistakes. The neighboring farmers became mentors and friends, always willing to share their knowledge and lend a hand when needed. I also started dating Tyler Long's nephew, Dennis Powell, who'd been named after my grandfather and had recently returned from agricultural college. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared values and common goals rather than just attraction. He understood my commitment to the farm and supported my vision for its future. Now, 5 years later, I can look back on that scared 18-year-old girl and hardly recognize her. The farm is thriving, with expanded cattle operations, diversified crops, and a small but profitable organic produce business that supplies restaurants in the state capital. The house has been completely renovated while maintaining its historic character, and the barn now houses not just cattle, but also the equipment for a modern agricultural operation. But the real transformation has been in me. I've gone from being someone with no family and no future to being deeply rooted in a community that depends on me as much as I depend on them. I serve on the board of the local agricultural cooperative, volunteer with foster children in the county system, and have become the kind of neighbor my grandfather would have been proud of. Karen Cooper never contacted me again after the court ruling, and I heard through local gossip that she'd moved to another state and remarried. I hope she found the happiness and peace that had always seemed to elude her. Holding on to anger and resentment would have dishonored my grandfather's memory and poisoned the life I was trying to build. The most important lesson I learned through this whole experience is that family isn't just about blood relationships or legal documents. It's about the people who show up for you when things get difficult, who believe in you when you don't believe in yourself, and who help you become the person you're meant to be. My grandfather gave me more than just a farm and financial security. He gave me a place to belong, a community to be part of, and a legacy to carry forward. Every morning when I walk out to check on the cattle, every evening when I sit on the front porch watching the sunset over fields I've planted and tended, I feel his presence and his pride. The pocket watch he left me sits on my desk in the study where he wrote those journals about searching for me. Sometimes I take it out and hold it, thinking about all the hands that have touched it and all the dreams that have been passed down with it. Someday I'll pass it on to my own children, along with the stories of their great-great-grandfather who never gave up hope and the farm that brought us all together. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you don't belong anywhere, like you're too different or too damaged to be part of something bigger than yourself, I want you to know that you're wrong. There's a place for everyone in this world, a community that needs exactly what you have to offer. Sometimes you have to travel 500 miles and fight a legal battle to find it, but it's out there waiting for you. I'd love to hear your stories about finding your place in the world or about unexpected gifts that changed your life. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. If this story inspired you, please share it with someone who might need to hear that they belong somewhere too. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about people who found their way home against all odds. The farm my grandfather left me wasn't just land and buildings. It was a chance to become who I was always meant to be. And that's a gift that keeps giving every single day.